The amber glow of Tokyo's evening lights reflected off the polished mahogany table, as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto spread the classified naval charts across his private study. It was January 7, 1941, and the architect of what would become history's most audacious naval surprise attack sat in contemplative silence, studying the blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean that separated Japan from its most dangerous potential enemy. "The American fleet must be destroyed at its source," Yamamoto murmured to himself, his weathered finger tracing the shipping lanes between the Hawaiian Islands and the continental United States. At 56, the combined fleet commander possessed a mind that combined tactical brilliance with strategic foresight, a combination that made him both Japan's greatest naval asset and its most dangerous gambler. The political winds in Tokyo were shifting toward inevitable war with the United States. Japan's expansion into China had triggered increasingly severe American economic sanctions, and the oil embargo threatened to strangle the empire's military machine within months. Yet Yamamoto, unlike many of his colleagues, harbored no illusions about Japan's chances in a prolonged conflict with America's industrial colossus. "If we must fight America," he had told his staff months earlier, "we must win in the first 6 months. After that, we will have awakened a sleeping giant whose productive capacity will crush us utterly." Commander Minoru Genda entered the study with the respectful bow that military protocol demanded, but his eyes gleamed with the excitement of a man who had been wrestling with an impossible tactical problem. "Admiral, I have completed the preliminary assessment of your Pearl Harbor concept." Yamamoto looked up from his charts with keen interest. Genda was arguably Japan's most brilliant air tactician, the innovative mind who had modernized the Imperial Navy's carrier aviation doctrine. If anyone could transform an audacious strategic concept into operational reality, it was the 37-year-old commander who had revolutionized naval air warfare. "The obstacles are formidable," Genda began, settling into the chair across from his superior. "Pearl Harbor lies 3,500 miles from Japan, beyond the operational range of our existing aircraft. The harbor itself is shallow, making conventional torpedo attacks impossible. American radar installations will detect any approaching force long before it reaches attack position. According to declassified documents examined by historian Gordon Prange in At Dawn We Slept, the initial assessment of a Pearl Harbor attack identified seemingly insurmountable technical and operational challenges that would require revolutionary solutions." Yamamoto nodded thoughtfully. Every obstacle Genda identified had already occupied his own strategic thinking for weeks. "And yet, Commander, what makes the target impossible to attack also makes it impossible to defend. American complacency is our greatest ally." The conversation that followed would shape the course of the Pacific War. Yamamoto's strategic vision was breathtaking in its scope. A carrier strike force would approach Pearl Harbor undetected, launch a devastating surprise attack that would cripple the American Pacific Fleet, then withdraw before effective retaliation became possible. The plan's success would depend entirely on achieving complete tactical surprise, something that required operational security beyond anything previously attempted in naval warfare. Genda's analytical mind began dissecting the concept into manageable components. "We would need to develop shallow-water torpedoes, modify our aircraft for extended range operations, and somehow approach within striking distance without detection. The logistics alone would require unprecedented coordination. The technical challenges can be solved," Yamamoto replied with quiet confidence. "What concerns me more is whether our political leadership possesses the resolve to authorize such an operation. This attack would guarantee American entry into the war." The irony was profound. Yamamoto, who had spent years in the United States and understood American industrial capacity better than any other Japanese officer, was planning the attack that would transform America from a reluctant neutral into an implacable enemy. His strategic calculus was based on necessity rather than desire. If war was inevitable, Japan's only hope lay in achieving decisive victory before American strength could be mobilized. Over the following months, the concept that began in Yamamoto's study would evolve into the most complex naval operation in history. Training programs would be established at remote bases where pilots could practice attacking mock battleships in shallow harbors. Intelligence networks would be activated to monitor American fleet movements and defensive preparations. Most critically, the operational plan would be refined to achieve the element of surprise that made success possible. The seed of Pearl Harbor had been planted in the mind of a brilliant admiral who understood that his nation's survival depended on a single, perfectly executed blow. The silent approach had begun not with ships and aircraft, but with the strategic vision of a man who saw clearly into the future and understood that Japan's only path to victory lay through the destruction of the American fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor. The die had been cast, though few yet understood the magnitude of what was being set in motion. The mist-shrouded training facilities at Kagoshima Bay echoed with the roar of aircraft engines as Commander Mitsuo Fuchida pushed his Nakajima Kate torpedo bomber into a steep dive toward the mock battleship targets floating in the shallow waters. It was September 15, 1941, and Japan's most experienced naval aviators were perfecting techniques that would soon shock the world into recognizing the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. "Lower! Lower!" shouted Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata from the observation platform as his pilots practiced the impossibly dangerous shallow water torpedo runs that conventional wisdom declared suicidal. The torpedoes had to be dropped from an altitude of less than 50 feet in water, barely 40 feet deep, a margin of error measured in split seconds and feet that separated success from catastrophic failure. The technical challenges of attacking Pearl Harbor had seemed insurmountable when first conceived, but Japanese ingenuity was systematically eliminating every obstacle. Naval ordnance specialists had developed modified Type 91 torpedoes equipped with wooden stabilizing fins that prevented them from diving too deep in shallow water. Aircraft manufacturers had extended fuel capacity and reduced weight to achieve the range necessary for the unprecedented 3,500-mile round trip. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, recently appointed commander of the 1st Air Fleet, watched the training exercises with growing confidence. The 54-year-old officer had initially opposed the Pearl Harbor operation as too risky, but the meticulous preparation and innovative solutions being developed by Yamamoto's staff had gradually convinced him that success was possible. "Admiral," reported Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, his chief of staff. "Intelligence reports indicate the American Pacific Fleet maintains its regular Sunday morning routine at Pearl Harbor. Security remains minimal, and most personnel are granted shore leave on weekends." The intelligence picture was indeed favorable. Japanese agents in Hawaii, led by the meticulous Takeo Yoshikawa operating under diplomatic cover, had been monitoring American naval routines for months. Their reports painted a picture of peacetime complacency that bordered on negligence, the perfect conditions for achieving the tactical surprise upon which the entire operation depended. Declassified FBI documents analyzed by historian John Toland, in infamy, reveal that Japanese intelligence gathering in Hawaii was far more extensive and sophisticated than American counterintelligence services realized at the time. 3,000 miles away in Washington, warning signs were accumulating, like storm clouds on the horizon, but bureaucratic inertia and peacetime mentality prevented effective response. Magic intercepts decoded Japanese diplomatic communications, revealed growing tensions and preparations for military action, but the specific target remained hidden behind layers of operational security that Japanese planners had constructed with obsessive care. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, reviewed the latest intelligence summaries with growing concern. "The Japanese are clearly preparing for something significant," he told his staff during a morning briefing. "But where will they strike? The Philippines? Thailand? The Dutch East Indies?" Pearl Harbor never appeared on the list of likely targets. American strategic thinking remained trapped in conventional assumptions about the limitations of naval aviation. The idea that carrier-based aircraft could successfully attack a heavily defended naval base 3,500 miles from their launching point seemed beyond the realm of possibility. Meanwhile, in the remote anchorage of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled was taking shape in absolute secrecy. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, gathered with their escort of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in the fog-shrouded waters that would serve as the launching point for Operation Z, as the Pearl Harbor attack had been designated. Vice Admiral Nagumo boarded his flagship Akagi on November 22nd, carrying sealed orders that would not be opened until the task force was well at sea. The operational security surrounding the mission was unprecedented. Only a handful of senior officers knew the true destination, and radio silence would be maintained throughout the approach to ensure complete surprise. The human drama unfolding aboard the Japanese carriers was intensely personal. Pilots wrote final letters to their families, uncertain whether they would survive the mission. Mechanics performed countless inspections on aircraft that would soon carry their nation's hopes across the vast Pacific. Ships' crews prepared for the longest and most dangerous voyage in naval history, knowing that success or failure would determine Japan's fate in the coming war. Commander Fuchida, selected to lead the first wave of attackers, studied reconnaissance photographs of Pearl Harbor with the focused intensity of a man whose decisions would shape history. The anchorage appeared exactly as intelligence had reported. Battleships moored in neat rows, carriers absent on training missions, defensive preparations minimal. "Gentlemen," Fuchida addressed his squadron commanders during the final briefing, "we have been given the opportunity to strike a blow that will echo through history. The success of our empire depends on the next few hours of preparation and the courage we display when battle is joined." The pieces were falling into place for the most audacious surprise attack in naval history. Japanese strategic vision, tactical innovation, and operational security were converging toward a single moment that would transform the Pacific into a theater of total war. The silent approach was entering its final phase. The gray waters of the North Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions as the Japanese striking force steamed eastward through the pre-dawn darkness of November 26, 1941. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, feeling the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders like the cold North Pacific wind. Behind him, in perfect formation, sailed the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines, all maintaining absolute radio silence as they approached the point of no return. "Admiral, we have passed the designated coordinates," reported Captain Hasegawa, the Akagi's commanding officer. "Shall I signal the fleet to come about?" Nagumo hesitated for a long moment, staring into the darkness that concealed his destination. Once the fleet continued eastward, there could be no turning back. The attack on Pearl Harbor would proceed, regardless of diplomatic developments, and Japan would be committed to total war with the United States. The decision that had been made in Tokyo's war rooms now rested entirely on his shoulders. "Maintain course and speed," he ordered quietly. "Signal all ships. Operation Z will proceed as planned." The sealed orders that Nagumo had carried from Japan lay open on the chart table behind him, their contents now revealed to the senior officers who would execute the most audacious naval operation in history. The target was indeed Pearl Harbor, and the attack would commence at dawn on December 7th, a date that would become seared into the collective memory of 2 nations. Below decks, the controlled chaos of final preparations reached fever pitch. Aircraft mechanics performed last-minute inspections on the 414 planes that would soon launch the assault. Armorers checked and rechecked the specially modified torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs that would transform the American battleship row into a graveyard of twisted steel. Pilots studied their target folders one final time, memorizing every detail of the harbor they would attack at sunrise. According to combat records preserved in the Japanese Defense Agency archives and analyzed by historian Hiroyuki Agawa in The Reluctant Admiral, the final approach to Pearl Harbor represented the culmination of the most sophisticated naval operation attempted to that date. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida gathered his squadron leaders in the Akagi's ready room for the final briefing. The 39-year-old pilot who would lead the first wave bore the responsibility for coordinating an attack involving aircraft from 6 different carriers against multiple targets spread across Pearl Harbor and the surrounding airfields. "Gentlemen, our intelligence reports indicate 8 battleships currently moored at Pearl Harbor," Fuchida announced, pointing to the detailed reconnaissance photographs spread across the briefing table. "The primary targets are the battleships California, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. Secondary targets include the cruisers and destroyers in the harbor, as well as the fuel storage facilities and naval shipyard. The absence of American aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor represented both an opportunity and a concern. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea on various missions, which meant they would escape the attack but remain as future threats to Japanese operations. Fuchida's pilots would have to achieve maximum destruction of the available targets to justify the enormous risks they were taking. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, leading the torpedo bomber squadrons, studied the harbor layout with the intensity of a man whose life depended on split-second timing. The approach will be from the northwest, flying low over the harbor entrance. Each pilot will have approximately 30 seconds to identify his target, line up his attack run, and release his torpedo before climbing away from the anti-aircraft fire. The technical challenges remained formidable, even after months of intensive training. Pearl Harbor's shallow 40-foot depth meant that conventional torpedoes would drive themselves into the harbor bottom, but the modified weapons developed by Japanese ordnance specialists had never been tested under actual combat conditions. Success would depend on perfect execution of techniques that pushed both men and machines to their absolute limits. As the task force continued its eastward approach, diplomatic efforts in Washington entered their final phase. Ambassador Kichi Saburo, Nomura, and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu maintained the pretense of negotiating a peaceful resolution to American-Japanese tensions, but their instructions from Tokyo left no room for meaningful compromise. The diplomatic talks served primarily to maintain the element of surprise that was essential to the Pearl Harbor attack's success. President Franklin Roosevelt, increasingly convinced that war with Japan was inevitable, focused his attention on the Philippines and other American territories in the Western Pacific. The possibility of a direct attack on Pearl Harbor remained beyond the imagination of American strategic planners, who continued to view the Hawaiian Islands as too distant and too well defended to be vulnerable to Japanese assault. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, reviewed the latest intelligence reports from his headquarters overlooking Pearl Harbor. The assessments indicated growing Japanese military activity throughout the Pacific, but the specific threat to Hawaii remained undetected. American radar installations were operating on a limited schedule, and the patrol aircraft that might have detected the approaching Japanese fleet were grounded for maintenance and training. The convergence of factors that would make the Pearl Harbor attack possible was nearly complete. Japanese operational security had maintained perfect concealment of their intentions. American peacetime routines had created vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic. Most critically, the element of surprise remained intact as the Japanese striking force closed the final distance to their target. Dawn was less than 36 hours away, and with it would come the moment when Japan's silent approach would transform into the deadliest surprise attack in naval history. The point of no return had been passed, and both nations were now rushing toward a confrontation that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific forever. The pre-dawn darkness of December 7, 1941, enveloped the Japanese task force like a shroud of anticipation as flight deck crews made their final preparations for the attack that would transform the Pacific into a theater of total war. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the Akagi's bridge wing, watching the organized chaos below as his pilots climbed into cockpits that would carry them into history. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and the North Pacific swells rolled beneath the carrier's hull with the rhythm of destiny approaching. "All aircraft spotted and ready for launch," reported Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, leader of the fighter squadrons that would provide cover for the attacking bombers. The flight deck stretched away into the darkness, crowded with 43 aircraft armed with torpedoes, bombs, and the hopes of an empire that had staked everything on this single devastating blow. At 0530 hours, Admiral Nagumo gave the order that would change history. "Commence launching operations." The Akagi's engines increased to flank speed, and the carrier turned into the wind as the first Zero fighter roared down the flight deck and disappeared into the pre-dawn sky. Behind it, one by one, the remaining aircraft of the first wave took flight: 49 Kate torpedo bombers, 51 Val dive bombers, and 43 Zero fighters, all converging on Pearl Harbor from 6 different carriers. Fuchida's Kate, lifted off at 0600 hours, the last aircraft to leave the Akagi's deck. As he climbed through the scattered clouds, he could see the navigation lights of the other aircraft forming up in the precise formations they had practiced countless times in the training waters around Japan. Below, the second wave was already being spotted on the carrier decks. 54 Kate bombers armed with general-purpose bombs, 78 Val dive bombers, and 35 Zero fighters that would strike Pearl Harbor exactly 1 hour after the initial assault. The flight to Pearl Harbor took 1 hour and 40 minutes, during which Fuchida maintained radio silence while navigating by dead reckoning toward coordinates that existed only in his memory and on the carefully guarded charts, tucked into his flight suit. At 0740 hours, the northern shore of Oahu appeared through the morning haze, and with it, the target that had occupied Japanese strategic thinking for nearly a year. Combat reports declassified by the Naval Historical Center and analyzed by historian Gordon Prange in At Dawn We Slept document that the Japanese achieved complete tactical surprise due to a combination of operational security and American peacetime complacency. Pearl Harbor lay spread before the attacking aircraft, like a detailed model, exactly as reconnaissance photographs had depicted. 8 battleships rode at anchor along the southeastern shore of Ford Island, their gray hulls gleaming in the early morning sunlight. The harbor was peaceful, almost serene, with no sign that the defenders suspected what was about to befall them. At 0749, Fuchida transmitted the code words that would echo through history. Tora, Tora, Tora. The message meaning tiger, 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 informed the Japanese fleet that complete surprise had been achieved. Seconds later, the first bombs began falling on the unsuspecting American naval base. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led his torpedo bombers in a low-level attack that skimmed barely 50 feet above the harbor waters. The specially modified torpedoes, equipped with wooden stabilizing fins, struck the battleships Oklahoma, West Virginia, and California with devastating effect. The massive ships shuddered under the impact of explosions that tore gaping holes in their hulls below the waterline. Simultaneously, Commander Kakuichi Takahashi's dive bombers screamed down from 8,000 feet toward the battleship row. Their armor-piercing bombs, converted from 16-inch naval shells, penetrated the heavily armored decks of the Arizona and Oklahoma with apocalyptic force. The Arizona's forward magazine detonated at 0806, lifting the 32,000-ton battleship completely out of the water before settling back as a burning, sinking wreck. The attack unfolded with clockwork precision, despite the chaos and confusion that gripped the American defenders. Japanese pilots, trained to perfection through months of intensive preparation, executed their missions with deadly efficiency. Within the first 15 minutes, the American Pacific Fleet's battle line had been effectively destroyed. 4 battleships sunk or sinking, 4 others damaged, and the naval balance of power in the Pacific fundamentally altered. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, watched the destruction from his headquarters overlooking the harbor. The man who had dismissed warnings of a possible Japanese attack now witnessed the consequences of American unpreparedness. "My God, this can't be happening," he muttered, as the Arizona's magazines exploded in a fireball that rose 500 feet into the morning sky. At Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, Japanese fighters and bombers systematically destroyed American aircraft caught on the ground. The neat rows of parked planes positioned to prevent sabotage rather than air attack became easy targets for strafing runs that eliminated any possibility of effective aerial resistance. Within minutes, American air power in Hawaii had been reduced to smoking wreckage. The second wave, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, arrived at 0850 to find Pearl Harbor already shrouded in smoke and flame. Despite reduced visibility and increasingly effective anti-aircraft fire, the second wave pressed home its attacks against the damaged battleships and undamaged cruisers. The destroyer Shaw's forward magazine exploded in a spectacular fireball that would become one of the most famous images of the attack. By 10 o'clock, the last Japanese aircraft had departed Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a scene of devastation that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the attack's planners. The silent approach had culminated in 2 hours of destruction that would propel America into World War II and guarantee that the conflict would be fought to the bitter end. The smoke-filled skies above Pearl Harbor began to clear as the last Japanese aircraft disappeared into the western horizon, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would forever alter the course of world history. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida circled his Kate bomber above the burning naval base, conducting a final damage assessment that would determine whether a third-wave attack was necessary to complete the destruction of America's Pacific Fleet. Below him, Pearl Harbor resembled a vision of maritime apocalypse. The battleship Arizona had been transformed into a funeral pyre, her broken hull settling into the harbor mud while fires continued to rage in her superstructure. The Oklahoma had capsized completely, her upturned hull breaking the surface like the back of a beached whale. The West Virginia and California were sinking at their moorings, their crews fighting desperately to prevent total loss, while rescue operations commenced around the burning ships. All squadrons report successful completion of primary mission, Fuchida radioed to the carrier task force as he began his return flight to the Akagi. The first wave had achieved results beyond their most optimistic projections. 4 battleships sunk or sinking, 4 others damaged, and American naval air power in Hawaii effectively eliminated. The second wave had completed the destruction of auxiliary targets and ensured that Pearl Harbor would remain unusable as a major naval base for months to come. The human cost of Japan's triumph was becoming apparent as rescue operations intensified throughout the harbor. The Arizona alone had taken more than 1,000 sailors and Marines to the bottom with her, while hundreds more were trapped in the capsized Oklahoma. Hospital ships and ambulances converged on the scene as medical personnel struggled to treat the wounded and identify the dead from history's most successful surprise attack. According to official Navy casualty reports compiled by the Pearl Harbor History Associates and analyzed by historian Donald Goldstein in the Pearl Harbor Papers, the attack resulted in 2,403 American military personnel killed and 1,178 wounded. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo received Fuchida's damage assessment with satisfaction, tempered by strategic caution. The primary objectives had been achieved, the American battle fleet had been neutralized, and Japan now possessed unchallenged naval supremacy in the Western Pacific. However, the absence of American aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor meant that the most dangerous threats to future Japanese operations had escaped destruction. Admiral, Commander Fuchida requests permission to prepare a third-wave attack, reported Captain Hasegawa. He believes we can complete the destruction of the fuel storage facilities and naval shipyard. Nagumo studied the tactical plot showing his task force's position relative to Hawaiian-based American air power. The element of surprise had been lost, and prolonged operations in enemy waters would expose his carriers to increasing risk. More critically, the mission's primary objectives had been achieved. America's ability to interfere with Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia had been eliminated for the foreseeable future. Signal all carriers, recover aircraft and prepare for immediate withdrawal, Nagumo ordered. We have accomplished what we came to do. The decision to forego a third-wave attack would later be criticized by historians as a missed opportunity to inflict even greater damage on American capabilities. The fuel storage tanks that escaped destruction contained sufficient oil to support fleet operations for months, while the undamaged naval shipyard would prove crucial to repairing the damaged battleships. However, Nagumo's caution reflected sound tactical judgment. The longer his force remained within range of Hawaiian air bases, the greater the risk of devastating counterattack. As Japanese aircraft landed on their carriers throughout the morning, pilots reported their experiences with the excitement of men who had participated in a historic victory. The months of intensive training had paid dividends in the form of precise attacks that maximized damage while minimizing Japanese losses. Only 29 aircraft had been shot down, a remarkably low casualty rate that testified to both the effectiveness of Japanese tactics and the completeness of the surprise achieved. Lieutenant Fusada Ida, whose Zero fighter had been damaged during the attack on Kaneohe Naval Air Station, made the ultimate sacrifice by deliberately crashing his aircraft into a hangar rather than risk capture. His death exemplified the spirit of total commitment that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible, though few could foresee that such dedication would ultimately prove insufficient against America's industrial might and determination. The strategic implications of the attack were already becoming apparent to Japanese leadership. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the operation from his flagship in Japanese waters, understood that the tactical triumph at Pearl Harbor had achieved its primary objective, neutralizing American naval power long enough for Japan to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia. However, the attack had also guaranteed that the coming war would be fought without compromise or mercy. In Washington, news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached President Franklin Roosevelt as he was reviewing diplomatic correspondence in the Oval Office. The man who had led America through the Great Depression now faced the challenge of mobilizing the nation for total war against enemies on opposite sides of the globe. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, he would tell Congress the following day. The silent approach that had begun with Admiral Yamamoto's strategic vision 11 months earlier had achieved everything its architects had hoped. American naval power in the Pacific had been crippled. Japanese forces were free to advance southward toward the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and the empire had gained the strategic breathing space necessary to consolidate its expanded perimeter. Yet even in the moment of triumph, the seeds of ultimate defeat had been planted. The attack that was designed to deter American resistance had instead guaranteed it, transforming a reluctant democracy into an implacable enemy, determined to fight until total victory was achieved. The setting sun of December 7, 1941, cast long shadows across the oil-stained waters of Pearl Harbor as rescue crews continued their grim work among the twisted wreckage of America's Pacific Fleet. The silent approach that had brought Japanese naval aviation across 3,500 miles of ocean had culminated in the most successful surprise attack in naval history, but the very completeness of that success had awakened forces that would ultimately seal Japan's fate. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the deck of a rescue vessel, surveying the devastation that had ended his career and fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Pacific War. The Arizona continued to burn, her funeral pyre casting an orange glow across waters that had been peaceful just 12 hours earlier. Around the harbor, the evidence of Japanese tactical brilliance was undeniable. 18 warships sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and more than 3,000 American servicemen killed or wounded. Admiral, reported Captain William Smith, his chief of staff, preliminary damage assessment indicates that reconstruction of our battle line will require at least 18 months. The Japanese have achieved everything they could have hoped for. But even as American naval power in the Pacific lay in ruins, the industrial machinery that would ultimately overwhelm Japan was already beginning to mobilize. President Franklin Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8th had transformed American public opinion overnight, creating a unity of purpose that had been absent since the Civil War. The isolationist sentiment that had kept America out of the European conflict evaporated in the flames of Pearl Harbor, replaced by a determination to prosecute the war until total victory was achieved. According to production statistics compiled by the War Production Board and analyzed by historian Alan Millward in War, Economy and Society, American industrial output would increase by 50% between 1941 and 1943, providing the material foundation for ultimate victory. 3,000 miles to the west, the Japanese task force that had executed the Pearl Harbor attack was making its triumphant return to home waters. Admiral Nagamo's carriers had achieved a tactical masterpiece, but the strategic implications of their success were already becoming apparent to Japan's more perceptive leaders. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, understood that his gamble had succeeded tactically while potentially failing strategically. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," Yamamoto reportedly told his staff as news of the attack's success reached the Combined Fleet headquarters. Whether the quote was authentic or apocryphal, it captured the fundamental miscalculation that had driven Japan toward war with America: the belief that a decisive initial blow could deter prolonged resistance from a nation whose industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's by a factor of 10 to 1. The human drama of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the tactical success of the attack itself. In Tokyo, the news of victory was received with euphoria by a population that had been told for months that war with America was both inevitable and winnable. Emperor Hirohito, privately skeptical of the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, publicly endorsed the military's fait accompli, while harboring growing doubts about the ultimate outcome of the conflict his government had initiated. The diplomatic consequences of the attack were equally profound. Great Britain, fighting for survival against Nazi Germany, suddenly found itself with a powerful ally whose industrial capacity could tip the balance of the European war. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote that he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful upon learning that America had entered the war, understanding that British survival was now assured despite the immediate disasters in the Pacific. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, American military leaders began planning the response that would ultimately carry Allied forces to Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American forces in the Philippines, prepared for the Japanese assault he knew was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz, selected to replace the disgraced Kimmel as Pacific Fleet commander, began rebuilding American naval power from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor. The strategic irony of the Pearl Harbor attack was already becoming apparent to informed observers. Japan had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted devastating damage on American naval forces, but the attack had also eliminated the political constraints that had prevented American entry into the war. The isolationist movement that had kept America neutral despite 2 years of global conflict collapsed overnight, replaced by a national determination to achieve total victory regardless of cost. The carriers that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga would form the nucleus of American recovery in the Pacific. These ships, along with their battle-tested aircrews, would provide the striking power necessary to halt Japanese expansion and begin the long campaign that would culminate in Japan's surrender 3 years and 8 months later. The silent approach that had brought Japanese naval aviation to Pearl Harbor represented the zenith of their tactical capabilities and the beginning of their strategic decline. The attack that was designed to establish Japanese dominance in the Pacific had instead guaranteed a prolonged conflict that Japan could not win. The sleeping giant had indeed been awakened, and its terrible resolve would ultimately prove more powerful than the tactical brilliance that had made Pearl Harbor possible. As December 7th passed into history, 2 nations prepared for a struggle that would determine the future of the Pacific. America, bloodied but not broken, began mobilizing the industrial might that would overwhelm its enemies through sheer productive capacity. Japan, triumphant but overextended, prepared to defend conquests that had been gained through tactical brilliance but could not be held against an aroused democracy fighting for its survival. The greatest surprise attack in naval history had succeeded, beyond its planners' wildest dreams, but in doing so, it had set in motion the forces that would ultimately destroy the empire it was meant to preserve.